The question was, all I did
I'd
were
be
like,
curious to meet her.
oh, she's great.
I
She
like
lives
her
here.
book a lot.
She lives here.
I thought she lived in the desert or something.
She splits her time between the desert and Irvine.
Oh, right, because she
Right.
teaches there.
They're like, the panel was, what is the West? It was just,
This is what I'm talking about.
I've been on many of that panel there. We'll talk about it.
The store and bookstores in general, particularly this one. So thank you for being
I really
here
need those,
tonight.
but
We offer lots of stuff through Zippy Media, including a podcast. Moms don't have time to read books, so if you have any extra time, want to give that a listen, that's available. We do lots of events and retreats and fun stuff as well. So stay tuned. We have a mailing list and stuff for the store and for everything else. So happy to keep you up to date in
Ivy.
everything.
I'm Zippy's husband.
Nice to meet you.
I'm Rachel.
Nice
to meet you.
So thank you so much for being here. We have Rachel Kushner and Ivy Pochoda together in conversation, which is really thrilling. So I'll tell you a little bit about both of them and then turn the floor over. We'll talk for a little bit, Q&A, and then some book signing. Total shocker for a bookstore event, but that's what's happening. Okay. Rachel Kushner is the author of The Hard Crowd, her acclaimed essay collection, and the internationally best-selling author's novels, The Mars Room, The Flamethrowers, and Relics from Cuba, as well as a book of short stories, The Strange Case of Rachel K. She has won the Prix Medici, whatever.
Medici.
And has been a finalist for the Booker Prize, the National Book Critics Circle Award, the Folio Prize, and was twice a finalist for the National Book Award in Fiction. Her books are translated into 27 languages, and Creation Lake was shortlisted for the Booker Prize.
So
exciting.
I like the English cover.
Ivy Pochoda
cool.
is the author of the critically acclaimed novels Wonder Valley, Visitation Street, These Women, as well as Sing Her Down, which won the LA Times Book Prize. She won the 2018 Strand Critics Award for Best Novel and the Prix Page America in France, and has been a
The
finalist
Festival of America
for the
Award.
Edward Award, among other ones. Her writing appears frequently in the New York Times and Los Angeles Times. Ivy teaches creative writing at the Skid Row History Museum in Los Angeles' Skid Row. She's currently a professor of creative writing at the University of California, Riverside, Palm Desert, Low Residency MFA program, and is the author of Sing Her Down, which is up here and for sale afterwards. This is Liz Bedway with Booksellers and asking how you can maybe help and browse all the shelves, which are curated by person and topic, and will be something for you to discover before or after. And now, on to our show. Rachel and Ivy, come on down.
Thank you, Zippy. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Oh, these are really
Am I
tall.
going to fit back here? Like, oh my God. Oh, wow. A little bit. Like, do I have like large knees? Like, okay. Okay, thank you.
You're trapped.
Oops. Uh-oh. I'm having a
We
problem.
don't really need microphones.
It's
but
the live
apparently
stream.
We're live streaming.
We are live streaming and
So
Yeah.
don't say anything that you don't want
recorded forever.
recorded for posterity.
Okay. So this is exciting. We're catching you at the tail end of a 30-city or 30-day book tour.
Yeah, or 28. Yes, my book came out September 3rd. I had an event on the east side where I live near downtown Echo Park. And then I left the next morning. And then I just got back on Monday. And I was in a different city every day.
Wow.
By the time I got home, I was in Ireland and then flew via London back to Los Angeles. And I got home, that was Monday night. I went to sleep and I heard somebody coming into my room. And I said, "Who is in this room? Who is in this room?" And then I heard, "It's your husband." And I said, "What time is it?" And he said, "It's midnight." And I sat there in the dark thinking, how did my publicist know to get him a ticket? And did they put him on a train or did he take a plane here? And how did he figure out what room I was in? And like, that's sort of, there's some deep brain that was scrambled by
At least he didn't like attack him or something.
Yeah, yeah. But he said it's your husband in this kind of like understanding and exhausted way.
Oh, right. Who knows what else you've been saying before that? Did you want to read or do you want to just get going? It's totally up to you.
Either one. What?
Well, we can just start talking.
All right.
So,
okay.
I'm going to do this a little backwards by asking the question, and I don't want the answer to this actual question, that it always ends every book interview ever. So I was reading, you do your homework. I read a really generally fantastic interview in LitHub with Jane Chiabateri. I cannot pronounce her.
Chabatari.
Yeah, I see her. It's one of those words I see written out all the time, and I realized like 10 minutes ago I have to say it out loud.
Well, with Italian Americans, it really depends on how their family acculturated, because there's this wonderful writer, Salvatore Schibona. I don't know if people know his work. He wrote this incredible novel, The End. It was his first novel. And I'm friends with him, and I used to say Schibona just to kind of, because his family immigrated to the United States, and they decided they were Schibona.
Oh, gotcha.
Even as it's not how you would pronounce that. Anyway,
Jane Chiabateri, she's the head of the National Book Critics Circle.
So what did I say in that
interview?
Well,
I'm going to quote you. This is the only time this is going to be
I don't
horrifying.
back up anything I've said online.
That's okay. It's not really that incendiary. She ended the interview kind of like a little bit, traditionally by asking you what you're working on next. I don't need an answer. We're not going to talk about it. And I don't really care. That's not why we're here. But you said, I also want to get a bit of hindsight on my own novel and assess what I've done before starting something new. Even as part of me thinks it's better to just keep going, run, don't look back, keep on running and let others sort out what you've made. Now, I thought that was really interesting because I find that this book is in deep conversation with the Mars Room in certain ways that I haven't really seen talked about. And I was wondering if you really didn't look back at the Mars Room when you were writing this. Because,
no, never.
Wow, because you have a strong female character who's violent in a certain way, isolated, angry, detached, and there's the interstitial philosophy that's supporting her actions. And I just sort of thought that they might have had some confluence for you.
No.
Well, okay, next question.
No.
They just reminded each other so much.
The thing is again, that's the sort of for the others to sort
Right.
out. Because
Right.
like with each novel, I'm on a singular mission. And I maybe I'm using that word singular wrong, but meaning the experience is total.
Right.
And it's not at all that having written a novel previously would indicate any of the rules that I build for this one. It's like it's its own thing entirely. And it's all I think about when I'm writing it. And the book itself was an occasion to put all these things that matter to me into a kind of synthetic coherence.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, look, we all have a psychic structure that is partly dark to us,
right.
And that maybe could be illuminated by somebody who is a close reader going from novel to novel and seeing like, oh, there's a faint echo here.
Right.
Like if you go to Lacanian analysis, which I'm sure many of you do, but no, I did. But it was like the analyst only has two tools really. They can repeat a word you said,
mm-hmm.
Or like if you make a sigh sound, they can make that sound, or they can end the session. But the repetition is like, that is for somebody else to point out maybe in the novels. But I was thinking much more, not about her psyche in the way that you just described it, but instead, it's about these young, nominally the original situation that I was inspired by is these young people who decamp from Paris to a remote rural part of southwestern France that is not really a thriving agricultural community any longer, the way that many rural parts of France no longer are, simply because it's very difficult there to be a farmer. And the price of milk that's set by the state or the European Union can be less than what it costs to produce. And a lot of these villages have had a lot of out migration over the years. Like young people just leave They want to move to a city. They want to maybe try to join the middle class. They end up working in the service sector at a grocery store. So these young people from Paris moved down there to set up this commune and are set basically on a collision course with the French state, right? Like that was the sort of situation. And it is echoed in things that I happen to know a lot about. There was a commune in the northern Corrèze that was raided by the French state in 2008. And I know some of those people. And my husband, as it just so happens, has translated a couple of their books. And one of their books was the cause of the raid. The French state said it was evidence of sedition. And I think it was like the first time that a book had been used as criminal evidence in France, maybe. In any case, the case got thrown out eventually. And like I had this world regionally that I know very well. I had a kind of idealism that I have a certain sympathy for, and a relationship that I've built up personally over years with farmers in that area, and understanding the kind of like social environment and what they're up against. And what I didn't have was a narrator, somebody who could come from outside and have reason to be there, interacting with these people, and also have access to the ideas of their mentor, who is a major character in the book, named Bruno Lacombe. He's in his 80s, and he's decided, having been a young radical, that capitalism is absolutely here to stay. There's no evidence that it's going to just like collapse, but he believes that there is some answer to the question of how to correct or right the human project so that it is in harmony with nature and in harmony with other people, so that we live in a more equal way. And his argument is about revolutionizing consciousness, and he sort of has rejected civilization and is now living in a cave. And he's kind of actually sort of loosely based on somebody that I always heard about through the young people in France. Like there's this, it's a writer named Jacques Camat, who supposedly does live in a cave, but then I knew people who were getting really long emails from him, but this was never presented as a contradiction. So I kind of said it as one of my tasks, like, don't ridicule this, make this believable. It's very touching to me that somebody is thinking about revolutionizing consciousness and taking quite seriously the idea that there is great meaning in the human project. Like I fully believe that myself. I'm comfortable with an ambiance of religiosity of the type of Bruno's, but who would be a narrator who would have access to Bruno and to these young people? And then I worked on the book for like 3.5 years. And then finally, I just woke up one Monday morning and started over. And it was Bruno's letters, the first 2 lines of the book. See, I don't have to read from it because I know them by memory. Is Neanderthals were prone to depression, he said. He said they were prone to addiction too, and especially smoking. And so, you know, he's like free to be a little bit lunatic and fantasize, but I knew that it was being told by someone else.
Right.
And I very quickly got the feeling that the person who was reading his letters was a hostile force, like somebody who was not sympathetic to the project of these young people. And it just so happened that, you know, we could talk about this, that I was aware of some forms of betrayal by people who'd been hired to surveil leftist activists. And so pretty soon that was her, but I don't really see her as angry at all, in fact.
No.
She's kind of joyous about her very amoral and despicable position in the world.
They're both quite joyous, I thought. I found like there's, you know, his letters are very funny, and then her sort of, okay.
Enjoy it. We're gonna trash this place while you guys are away.
On the live stream.
Thanks for the introduction.
Okay, so what do y'all want to talk about? There is this sort of, I find, you know, Sadie is very funny. Maybe it's funny to read, not her actions, but to read her reactions to things and to Bruno's letters and the way she interjects into them.
Yeah, she's comic.
She's comic, yeah. She's not lighthearted, but she's comic, and she's sort of, and it's an interesting addendum to his philosophy, because as the book goes on, she's interjecting less and less into it as it sinks in. But she is a spy, for those of you who haven't quite cottoned on to that. And this is both a spy novel and a novel of ideas, which, being someone who's mislabeled in the genre ghetto, is like an anathema. Like, you either have to write a thriller or you have to write like a really smart novel, which does a big disservice to crime. And because if crime has no meaning, or espionage has no meaning, then there's nothing to read about. So when you found Sadie as the fulcrum for Bruno and this world of the Moulinards, is that?
Yeah.
Did you know this was going to be an espionage novel?
Yeah. So it's funny how we're like,
I know. It's like watching a tennis tournament.
Yeah. I've never been to a tennis tournament.
It's kind of like this.
I watched Challengers. Can't be fun. So I didn't know originally it was going to be a spy novel, and I wouldn't really try to claim that it is, because I have a lot of respect for the genre, and I would imagine and do believe that in order to do that genre justice, you have to be a practitioner who has internalized its rules, and whether you submit to them or not, you have to know exactly what they are and what the history of it is. But so my relationship to it, I could say a few things about it. As soon as I figured out, so there's this backstory of why Sadie in particular is a spy, which is that this group that I mentioned who were raided by the French state in 2008, and that case crawled through the French system for 10 years and was eventually thrown out. They had been surveilled by this British agent from the Metropolitan UK Police. And he had been surveilling leftist activists in Germany, France, and England for several years, and then was surrounded by a group of young people. And it turns out, started having affairs with many different women.
Many affairs.
Yeah, many different women in these groups. And he had a supervising agent who was apparently just listening to the whole thing. So every time he would bed down with some woman, someone's listening to it. And I believe that it was through jealousy and not suspicion that he was a cop that a bunch of people surrounded him, because they opened his glove box of his van and they found all these passports with his picture and different names on them, and were kind of like, hey buddy, what's up with this? And apparently he started to cry, and he said, I'm so lost. I'm a confused, lost person. I love you guys. I believe in this. I'm giving the state false information. I've just backed myself into a corner. I don't know what to do. And then he was like, let's smash the state together, And then a week later, he completely disappeared. And
back to his wife and many kids.
Well, no, he was hired by the company that was previously called Blackwater. I knew people who were his victim. And this was all reported on a lot in the British, this very reliable newspaper called The Sun, and another called the Daily Mail. And I was following it with great interest, especially so about like 9 or 10 women ended up suing the Metropolitan Police and won. And it was like a real public relations mess for them. And then he countersued the spy, his name is Mark Kennedy. He countersued the UK police for, quote unquote, failing to protect him from falling in love.
Although he was already married with kids.
Oh, he was?
Yes,
Yeah.
it was on his passports when they found it.
Okay. So she knows more than I do.
I happen to, this is why I'm here, is I was listening to this podcast about this and reading the book at the same time. And I emailed you and I was like, what is going on?
And then there's like this other weird case where there was a UK spy named Bob Lambert who had a relationship and a child in one of these long-term surveillance assignments. And when that child became an adult, he sued the Metropolitan Police for, quote unquote, having a fictitious father. It's a very existential issue for these people. But reading about these cases and knowing people who were removed from one of them, there's another that Sadie kind of borrows as her founding story, which was a friend of a friend, somebody I knew, but like third hand, was an eco activist, and he was entrapped by this woman working for the FBI. And I mean, he sounds like he was very young and naive at the time and super attracted to this woman. And she kind of convinced him, like, hey, we are going to sleep together and have a relationship, but as part of our courtship, you need to go buy 500 pounds of nitrate fertilizer. And he ended up getting charged and convicted with a 21-year sentence in federal prison, 9 years of which he served before his lawyer was able to establish that he had been entrapped, and the case was thrown out instantly and he was set free that day. So I took that story as kind of her founding, and she's somebody whose psychology is built on being a disgraced agent,
Right.
who had this, and I guess that's a sort of classical thing. But about noir and the crime novel, I think I became interested in reading French crime novels, which is probably what gave me the green light, whether I'm authorized or not, to borrow elements of this genre. I got interested in it by reading these French crime novels from the 1970s by this writer, Jean-Patrick Manchette. And the reason I started reading those novels, well, I heard they were good, but also I had been in, that's okay, we'll wait. Now that Zibby's gone, we're going to trash this place.
Make phone calls.
So I had been in rural France visiting some people, and I was invited to the home of a French crime novelist up on a hill above a river. And it was explained to me later that after May of 1968, which is like very critical historic moment, historic compromise between the students and factory workers in France that almost really resulted in the dissolution of the state at that time, a lot of people afterward believed still that there was going to be a revolution in France, maybe in cities among factory workers. And then people thought, well, that's not going to happen. And the factory worker is not a revolutionary subject. He just wants to go to the movies on the weekend and buy an affordable car. What about the countryside? The peasant class in France has this like deep radical tradition of peasant revolts. And then during World War II, it's the site of the resistance movement, its most strong place. And it's like the peasantry has this possibility for revolution. So those who didn't move to the countryside to radicalize farmers, there was another option, which was becoming a French crime novelist. And it was explained to me like this is one of the things that you could do. And so Manchette was very formed by May of 1968. Okay. And his novels are incredibly funny to me because they involve or reproduce this political social sophistication and a wryness about France in the 1970s during, what was called like Les Trente Glorieuses, like this kind of miracle of France rebuilding itself after the war, and everybody having an affordable car and going to bars and restaurants on the weekends. And Manchette sort of makes fun of what French people were given in exchange for a more radical future. But he's also like Quentin Tarantino in the way that when he describes like the holding up of a Brinks vehicle or the kidnapping of a politician, he's looked at every single holdup and every single kidnapping that has ever been written into American crime fiction. And I only started really reading American crime fiction, like from the 1940s, these classical books, through Manchette, because these French writers are so influenced by American crime fiction. They kind of think that's what America is.
They love noir.
All a Raymond Chandler novel. They love this writer, Horace McCoy. Has anybody ever heard of Horace McCoy? So Horace McCoy wrote They Shoot Horses, Don't They? Yeah. Which we know as the movie. For them, it's the novel. There's also another novel called I Should Have Stayed Home, which is massive in France. And every kind of boomer age Frenchman, if you say you don't know that novel, they're like, you have never read Horace McCoy? So my husband's joke is always like, ask men about I Should Have Stayed Home, because it's so funny to hear them try to pronounce Horace McCoy.
They
Like,
love noir in France.
The H is very difficult, but they love noir.
They love it.
And so I think I just borrowed certain elements and started to run with it. And one thing that was really fun for me that I noticed in writing a novel that does have noir elements, or maybe in particular with this narrator, she is very certain that she has everything rigged and that it's all under control. And she's a perfectionist and she's going to screw over other people. She has set out to destroy their lives, not because she's angry at them or thinks ill of them, but rather that it's her job and she's a sort of dispassionate, amoral creature. But she in these scenes, she's convinced when she walks into a room that she can smell weakness in other people that they themselves cannot smell. And what it produces as the person behind the scenes making narrative is, I never have to fall for the contrivance that literary authors pretty often end up using, at least to some degree, which is a coincidence. There's always some coincidence. Whereas if you have a narrator who's a master manipulator, there is no coincidence because they're designing everything. By the way, it is freezing in here. Is there any way that we could just like give it a rest? It's reminding me of like my husband's from North Florida. Oh, my husband's from North Florida, and in his family, all the men are like, my air conditioner is 86,000 BTUs. You're like,
it's a big bragging rights.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
Yeah, it's also loud. It's interesting. She thinks she's controlling everything, but
I was starting to shake. I was so cold.
I thought that was your passion for the discourse. I love that she is, she thinks she's in control. You start to get the sense that she might be wrong as the book is going on. Like that you get enough of, even though you're telling it through her perspective, it's sort of masterful how we start to see people mistrusting her a little bit, but she doesn't quite react properly.
Well, there always has to be a secret intimacy, I think, managed and how do I put this? Sorry. There's a link between the author and the reader, and it has to be earned. Right. That's the word I was looking for. And this is a first-person novel. It's told in her voice. She makes a lot of very blunt declarations to the reader that are meant to kind of follow up in counterpoint what she says to the people in the book, almost in this Janus-faced way, like at one point later in the book, the sort of like young charismatic leader of the commune says, like, it's been so meaningful to have you here, and I think you should stay on. Right. She says, like most people, he was unable to read minds. Like there's little things that that she says. At the same time, there always has to be the secret registration between the author and the reader. I really love this novel by Nabokov, Pale Fire. Yeah. People know that book. And I reread that right before I wrote this. And I'm not saying like that you would get whiffs of Pale Fire, but I think it permitted me to have a narrator, like Charles Kinboat, who tells that story, who's analyzing this long poem by John Shade, is a complete lunatic.
He's a lunatic, yeah.
And like the more you read it, the more masterful Nabokov seems. Like the first part, he's giving this like formal exegesis of this text as though he is this fancy English professor like Nabokov himself famously was. And then suddenly there's this parenthetical that says something like, the music from this amusement park is driving me crazy. And he's at a motor lodge, which I think of Nabokov is maybe the most deeply American author of all time, because he set so many things at motels.
Motels, yeah.
And it's like you go from the car into the door of this private space you've rented for the night. There's no porter. There's no monitor there. It's just ripe for sociopathological behavior. Anyway, so maybe I was thinking of that a little bit, just in terms of producing this instability between Sadie and Bruno, because Sadie, for her side, like she says things to the, as she's describing this life she's living to the reader, you know, no one is real to her because she lives from alias to
Right.
alias. So when she describes past events, it's past situations where she was screwing people over. Like she ends up having an affair with one of the members of the commune, even as she is ridiculed. She mentions the real agent that I was telling you about, who you have to furnish your parallel universe with,
Right.
with reality factor. So she mentions Mark Kennedy, not by name, but like, oh, this guy was sleeping with all these different women. He was surveilling, what a slob, you know. And she succumbs to sleeping only with one guy in the commune. And she mentions that in the throes of intimacy, there's this smell that issues from his armpits that smells to her like marijuana. And some men's armpits really do have that smell. And, you know, but I mean, I'm, you know, talking in the real world. Anyway, you would think that would be like a kind of grassy, innocent, wholesome smell. And it reminds her of the bust of a large grow facility in Idaho that she orchestrated. So she's like fondly remembering sending a lot of people to prison. At the same time, you know, before she invites him over, she decides to clean up this place where she's staying. And as she says, like, there were two mirror image, like living, like parlors with pocket doors. And when she filled one with empty beer cans and wine bottles, she just closed the pocket doors and started throwing her trash in the other. And her attitude is that her life is not real and there's no reason to clean up. There's no reason to treat the world as if it's not disposable, to treat it with care, because it's never hers. And she's going to leave it and reinvent herself a month later. And so it was thinking about that that made me have her act like that. And I assumed that the reader would kind of find it shocking in the way I found it shocking, but also see it as a kind of ontological predicament that she's in. Because if any of us ever for a moment thinks that things don't matter, we are really in a bind philosophically, you know, because how do you proceed from there? And that is partly her bind. And I wanted the reader to be able to recognize it in a way that she doesn't.
And she can't see the people she's manipulating as people and having their own agency and maybe not falling into line with her. And it's signaled through her sort of, especially dismissal of the women in this commune. She's got a very almost narcissistic attitude towards them, and then can't quite see that maybe because she's just going to move on and become somebody else after this.
Yeah, I mean, there's a brutality to her, and she points out some of the contradictions of the commune. Like the leader has shown her their communal daycare, and there are just these like kind of bored, pissed off women chain smoking, and then two little boys throwing sand at each other. And she says, "So it's communal. Everybody in the commune helps out." And he says, "Yes." And so she says, "So those two babies right there are not the children of the two women at the table, you know." And he says, "Oh, well, those two women just happen to be the mothers of the two kids who are here, but it is a communal daycare." And the thing is, you know, and then he says, like, it's true, we're not the first to experience this problem, that the gendered division of labor reasserts itself in the commune form, where everybody's trying to share things. Like, you want it to be all equal, and then after a while, before you know it, the men are repairing tractors and the women are cooking and taking care of babies. And I think that that's true, and I can see his side of it, that this does happen. And Sadie, moreover, is not a feminist, and so she's not criticizing this from a place of justified righteousness
or wanting to correct it.
She's just pointing out people's contradictions. And she's this weird creature. Like she says early in the book, as she's seducing the guy who's nominally her boyfriend, she approaches him because it's advantageous for her professionally to make this link, because he's childhood friends with the leader of the commune. She meets him by what she calls cold bump in a bar, and describes herself to the reader as good looking in an incredibly banal way. Like she says that she has no distinguishing characteristics really, so that after she's screwed everybody over and left, when they go to describe her, it's she had brown hair, brown eyes or green, clear skin, small nose, symmetrical features. Like there's nothing really to describe her by. And then when she seduces him, she's in this bar and she says, you know, I was in a t-shirt that kind of shows her breasts through it, and that her breasts do not require a bra. A few women can claim this, and then there's another line, are my breasts real? Does it matter? Which is more of her not even really being a real person.
Being in her own body
world.
either.
Yeah. So she is just more like a machine compared to the other women in the book who are wonderfully, perfectly imperfect, which is where real beauty derives from anyway. It's the way that it deviates from the standard.
And they're wonderfully suspicious of her, and they're not really swallowing this act that
the women are not. Like she has this line later in the book where she says she doesn't want to swim in front of the other women because she has this like kind of cliched perfect body, and she's been suntanning nude up at the place where she's staying. And she says, the thing is, if you want to, I can't remember my own thing. It's, if you want to please the men, you will not please the women. You know, but by pleasing the women, you won't necessarily displease the men. So they've convinced her to jump off this cliff, and everyone's jumping off of it. And it's the one place where she starts to seem like she shows vulnerability to the reader. And she decides to jump because they're saying like, hey, you know, come jump with us. She says, the thing I hate about jumping, which is borrowed from me, is like, you cannot change your mind once you've committed. I just can't stand that. So I was able to give her a little vulnerability there. She jumps in her t-shirt and shorts because she doesn't want to displease the women by pleasing the men.
As if she's not going to do that anyway. Like she's well on her way to displeasing the women by this point.
Well, I can't justify her thought process in that moment.
I just love it. It's such a human moment. It is her vulnerable moment where it's so much insalvageable, I think. At least from my perspective, like she's so male-focused in all of her dealings at the commune that these women have already sort of turned against her, and there's nothing that she's going to be able to do about it. I'm supposed to keep the show on time when it feels like it's audience question time, which feels quick. So I wanted to ask you about the France of this book. Somebody asked about the France of this book.
Well, there's also the Neanderthals.
Yeah, I want to talk about that too.
And the caves.
I wanted to talk about the cave. Well, I was wondering if you live in this, you vacation or have a house in this part of France.
Well, we don't have a house in France. Right. I would love to have a house in France. But so I've been going to this part of southwestern France where the book is set for 13 years now, maybe. We have friends who live there and we rent a house. And my son started going to a summer camp in a very remote area when he was 7. He's now 17. And the last 2 summers he worked at that camp. And this whole part of France has underground cave structures, limestone caves underneath it. And I've found that when you go back to the same place every summer, you really get to know it in a much deeper way. And you get to know farmers, and like we know people who speak Occitan as their first language, not French. And people who have on their own property or while walking the riverbeds have collected hand carved tools that are 500,000 years old, like really old stuff. And there are paths you can walk there that have been continually walked for 100,000 years. And there's places when you're going under a limestone shelf and you suddenly realize, as I did initially, I'm walking through someone's rooms right now because people would hang animal skins from the overhanging shelf. And then we met this family who the grandfather was the first person to discover Neanderthal artifacts in this part of France. It's in the Vézère Valley. It's called the Vallée de l'Homme. And it's just talking to people over the years. There's Neanderthal jewelry that's supposed to be managed and owned by the state of France, but it's in the possession of this woman who's the mayor of this town. And there is like no official mayordom, and you can email her and she's supposed to like show you the jewelry. And every summer it's like a joke. I try to contact her so I can see the jewelry. So I started thinking about, ancient life and caves because it's all right there. And my son goes into caves where he goes a mile underground, sometimes wading through water that is 50 degrees and it's neck deep. And early on, he told me about a cave that he went into that the whole interior of the cave is flocked white. And I pictured that stuff. I always wanted my mom to buy it to put on the Christmas tree. And he said it was sparkling. I mean, they wear headlamps. It's completely dark, but they can see with their headlamps. And he said it's magnesium crystals. It's some natural geological phenomenon. And I think it was like hearing that really triggered something. So I have this character, Bruno, who lives underground. Also, as I mentioned, there's a mentor to some of the young people I know in France who supposedly lives in a cave. And Bruno is my version of somebody who's living in a cave. And I would hear from my son the details of what these underground structures were like. So I had him read some of the descriptions in the book, partly because this New York Times journalist was doing a profile of me. And she asked my son, like, so is it accurate? And he goes like, I have not read her book. So then the next morning, like we had dinner with her and my husband and I were like, look, man, you got to throw me a bone here. Like just read the pages that were in Granta magazine, which described the cave. And so he read it and I said, what did you think? He goes, it was pretty good. He likes Colm Toybeen's books better than mine, but he's never read a book of mine.
We'll talk about that further.
He loves Colm. They're quite friendly.
Okay.
But it's more exciting if it's read with an Irish accent, which if I tried to read my own book that way, it would be doubly discouragement for him to dig in. But so I asked him, like, so what about the cave stuff? And he goes, no, it's good. It was accurate. He goes, the one thing is the cave with the magnesium crystals on it, you make it kind of sound like Bruno just sort of pops in there one day. And he goes, in my experience, it was an hour of struggling through a crevice so tight that I couldn't turn my head. I mean, yeah, I know. I couldn't imagine doing that, but I have somebody else who went underground and I know the above ground world of this book in the way that Bruno describes it. I mean, he has this description of the light of napping under a walnut tree. Although somebody told me that if you sleep under a walnut tree in the French countryside, it can make you crazy.
Because you get hit in the head with a walnut?
No, it's something to do with the light.
Okay.
This writer who I really love, Maëlys de Kerangal, she's a beautiful writer, wrote this book called Painting Time, a novel. She told me that, and I thought, but that's perfect, because Bruno describes it as the perfect place to nap. And then she naps under the walnut tree. And it's not clear who's more sane, but I have deep sympathy for Bruno, and she eventually kind of softens to his way.
Very much so. I love Bruno's philosophy and the way he sees the world. I just thought it was so beautiful. I mean, he's got a very sad backstory, and it's childhood, which you should read the book. I'm not going to tell you. But I just thought that the pausing and not the way he sees the future and the way he envisions the problems of the way we are hurtling towards the future, and his sort of incredible intimate relationship with the Neanderthal past, the point where he can hear the voices in the cave, was so beautiful that I didn't really care if he was a little bit crazy. Like it was so, when someone believes something so strongly and it means like it's so ingrained and powerful in them, I sort of, the impracticalities of that sort of immaterial, they wash away from me. And I just found the way you described his philosophy incredibly soulful and sad,
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I mean, I think prehistory itself is ripe for speculation, and there's some deep yearning there to figure out who it is we were supposed to be. Like this idea that, no one has yet come forth to explain. And Bruno's sense maybe is that there are messages that were somehow left for us along the way that we've lost the ability to read. And he's looking for where a wrong turn was taken in the human project. And as he puts it, currently we are careening off a cliff in a driverless car. And the question is, how do we exit this car? I think it's a reasonable question to ask. And I had this image of Bruno as this man who is literally putting his ear to the wall of the cave and hearing frequency that to him as a child of the 20th century reminds him of shortwave. I had a shortwave radio as a child, and I was really interested in the sort of art of tuning in. And Bruno thinks that he's tuning in to a place where he's finally liberated from calendar time, which is an isolated existence for us. And he can hear the voices of, the brave resistance fighters who, thought that the Nazis did go through this part of France. And there's a lot of monuments there to all the people that they killed, and they burned whole villages, including the city of Ruffignac. But so it's like he can hear the voices of resistance fighters. He can hear the voices of children who fell into caves in the 19th century. And then he kind of goes all the way back and recites all the different layers of calendar time and how it all merges into this one plane of reality in the underground world. Sadie reads this and kind of psychoanalyzes him and thinks, oh, he's just merging into this place, thinking that he's now occupying a plane of reality that is also occupied by his daughter,
Right.
who died when she was 8 when he was teaching her to drive a tractor. So that's there in the story. As you say, it's like part of his sad, what he carries is his burden. But the longing for that, I don't know, once you get into it, it's Bruno. I felt very close to Bruno in a way. And he has this kind of homespun philosophy where to him, the Neanderthal and maybe, other species like it were these kind of beautiful losers. Like, what happened? They just couldn't hack it, Like when I was growing up, the Neanderthal was a derogatory term. And Bruno sort of takes, but I always, as a child, like I was always for the underdog, like whoever lost the game. Like if an adult was humiliated in a situation as a child, I felt for them. And I started to feel that way about Bruno's Neanderthal, like when you read about the anthropological findings of, Homo sapien versus Neanderthal in the realm of art, for instance, we have Lascaux, we have Chauvet, we have exquisite, incredible paintings that human beings did on cave walls. And it was like they understood cinema and Edward Muybridge and the galloping legs of the horse before we did, because they put extra legs on these creatures. And in the flickering light of a torch, it truly is like Homo sapiens underground cinema house. And you go like, wow, this is dazzling. And then with the Neanderthal, they'll find like one piece of bone that has 2 marks on it. And they're like, it's art, And then you go, maybe somebody was cutting something and then there's just residue from underneath. And we just don't yet know. But to Bruno, he's like, abstract art is the truly refined, real art. And in fact, the Homo sapien, by producing this imagery of the animals on the walls in the hunt, is in fact already revealing this growth at any cost mindset. And he's reproducing imagery exclusively of eating and killing.
Right.
And it's just about materialism and stuff and cruelty and power dynamics. And I don't necessarily believe this, but this is Bruno's way of trying to build an advocacy that shows him a future in the past of a world where there were many different ways of being human.
And he's losing his audience, which is why I'm rooting for him. Like you can see that he is, with this philosophy, the Moulinards are moving into a totally different path.
They are.
And that I felt I was,
But maybe he has one disciple.
maybe, just maybe.
And then
That's all he needs.
the end reveals who that is.
Okay, question time. For those folks in the live stream, turn it off. Watch us raid the bookstore.
Do you think Zibby's watching right now?
We'll see.
One of those huge projectors at the end of their family thing. And it's just
Nothing says Rosh Hashanah like a book of it.
Yes.
Have you and or Bruno read Clan of the Cave Bear?
It's funny you ask that. I have to confess, there's multiple ones of them,
I
right?
just read one at a beach house.
There's like
One.
20.
But if you read that first one, it so echoes what you're talking about. I wondered if you read it as a kid.
I read the beginning of it as an adult.
Yeah, and it's so cheesy. But
yeah, I couldn't.
the philosophy is
Well,
very much what you're talking about.
yeah, I mean, I think that so from what I understand, it's funny. I love that you're the first person who's asked me that. But when I was writing the book, everyone asked me that. They would be like, "Clan of the Cave Bear," and my understanding is that she wrote that after this site called Shanidar was discovered, and what they discovered there was evidence of pollen, and what that pollen meant. In speculation, there's no real proof, was that it was a formal burial site and that Neanderthals, in fact, had cared for their young, had buried their young.
Culture.
Anthropologists have these way of like defining societies and care. And if there's somebody who died of old age who showed a disability, then it's clear that other people cared for that person, and et cetera. And my understanding is that Shanidar had just been discovered before she wrote that, and that maybe it inspired this idea that, that there's this slim overlap between Neanderthals and Homo sapiens when they both occupied Europe and Asia. And it's like wonderful to think about that. I mean, for a minute, I thought I would actually write a novel. So William Golding, who wrote Lord of the Flies, also wrote a Neanderthal Homo sapien novel. It's called The Inheritors. It's not a great novel. I mean, Lord of the Flies is like, you never forget that when you read it as a child. The Inheritors is more like, it's like a B+ novel. The thing is that it's hard to write a novel about people in prehistory because you take away your own range of, humor is so inflected with culture. We are, as people, shaped by the historical context in which we live, that I just think it would be really hard to pull that off well. But for a minute after I finished my last novel, I thought, what if I just wrote a novel set in prehistory? I mean, it's kind of a flex.
Well,
if
it's
you can pull
tricky
it off.
because they spend so much time surviving and not getting killed that they don't have a lot of time for like emotional development.
I think there's
like,
one. Yeah, no, that's
it's a real problem.
Very good point. Which
Exactly.
I think there is one novelist, no longer living now, died 2 years ago, who is the only one I could think of who could do it well. And that is Cormac McCarthy. And the reason is that Cormac McCarthy is a pure behaviorist. Like, he could write a 30-page scene of a guy trying to start a fire, and because he's not concerned with interiority and psychological complexity, he's men doing and fixing.
Well, also because he's the great poet and
I love
understander of
Cormac McCarthy,
human
by the way.
violence, that he could really write a book on prehistory because his understanding of our impetus to be violent as the core nature would be a very good jumping off point.
I disagree with him about that personally. But
he'd be good at prehistory if we put that in there.
Yes, but you want some beauty there too. There would be the Neanderthal as artist would be lost in that regard. But I think Cormac became like that later on more. Like, the version of him that wrote The Road, to me, is not the same man who wrote Outer Dark and The Orchard Keeper. And
No,
Child
definitely
of
not.
God. It's a Hobbesian, grim. Once he has people running toward you with human meat packed in between their
I think
teeth,
Blood Meridian sort of changed.
Cormac McCarthy is like, he's no longer, there's no hope left. Was there another question back there? Did I see? Yes.
I was wondering about the author that you had accompany the politician, Michael Thompson, Michelle.
Oh, yeah. Thanks for asking about that.
Is that Michelle Lubeck?
Yeah, so it is actually.
What's your
And
opinion of Michelle Lubeck?
I love Welbeck. I didn't, there's a little bit of a parody in the book. Michelle Thomas, or Michelle Thomas, I think it's Thomas, is actually the birth name of Michelle Welbeck. And at first I had just the French author, and then my husband said, just put Michelle Thomas, that's his birth name. And it doesn't matter whether or not you recognize it as Welbeck. It doesn't require knowing anything about him, but she describes him as the most famous living French author, which Welbeck certainly is. And when I was trying to write this book, before I figured out how to do it, before I landed on Sadie as Bruno's interpreter, and the idea that she's like this spy, that I've occupied the voice of this kind of devil who's moved in to as an agent of destruction to this place, I was trying to think about how to do it. And, I'm trying to write a novel that in part involves people living in a rural area and dairy farmers.
Mhm.
And Welbeck's novel Serotonin came out, which he trained as an agronomist. And it's a novel about an agronomist and about dairy farmers facing off against police in France, which is reality. But I thought, oh man, Welbeck has beat me to the punch and has written this incredibly funny novel. And I was talking to a friend of mine and he said, just put him in the book. And I thought, well, in terms of the chronology, because my book is sort of loosely set in 2013, she never says what year it is, but she says that Get Lucky by Daft Punk is the song of the summer, which it very much was. And not every summer gets a song. So that summer is easily recognizable to some people. But he would have been writing Serotonin at that time. So I decided that he is traveling to this agricultural fair to research his, as she puts it, agronomy novel, whatever that is.
Yeah.
When in fact, I'm a fan of that novel, and have read it several times. And it's just a light cameo, he's not a critical component of the novel. And it made sense for me, just in terms of the structure of it, to have him with this politician. And I didn't know until after I wrote the book that he's in fact quite close friends with Bruno Le Maire, who is the Minister of the Economy, I believe.
Oh, funny.
And that's what his new novel, Annihilation, is about. Thanks for asking about that.
Any other questions? Okay. Nope.
We're almost coming on 7:00.
We're supposed to be finished at 6:45 according to the instructions.
Oh, we were?
Yes.
Oh, okay. So then don't feel any guilt. I absolve you of guilt for not coming up with another question. Thanks everyone for coming. Thank you. Thank you, Ivy.
Thank you.
Purchase, we'll have them staying here and we can get used to sign some copies.
Great.
Oh,
I'm going to buy a copy of Ivy's book.
Perfect.
I don't do
Really
Oh,
quick,
yeah, sure.
So it all.
I never have anyone sign my book. It's too late to start, so I'll just take the train.
Yes.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thanks for coming. Thank you.